The black box recovered from the debris field was no bigger than a human fist. It floated in the cold dark for 9 hours before the salvage drone picked it up. Inside it held 42 minutes of footage. 42 minutes that would change the shape of the known galaxy forever. The UNHS Mercy's Hand had never been a warship. It carried no weapons. Its hull was painted white with a red cross large enough to be seen from 600 kilometers away. Its flight path had been filed with the Galactic Conclave's border authority 4 days before departure. The humanitarian marker it flew was recognized by every known species. Every one of them had signed the Treaty of Loran, which said, in plain language, that ships like this one were untouchable. The Conclave patrol that fired on it knew all of this. The first shot hit the port cargo bay where the medical team had been sorting crates of blood substitute and bone repair gel for a disaster zone 3 systems away. 17 people died before they understood what was happening. The second shot hit the triage bay. The third collapsed the bridge. Dr. Rael Akin was in the lower deck at the time, prepping surgical tools. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead hard enough to crack 3 ribs. He got up anyway. He sealed a hull breach with his hands and a patch kit. Then he moved through the smoke and the screaming and the silence that was worse than screaming, and he did what doctors do. He tried to save people. 89 of his crew did not make it. 191 did, because Akin refused to stop moving for 11 straight hours until a rescue ship arrived. The Conclave patrol did not stay. They left the way they came. When the rescue team pulled Akin out through the emergency hatch, he was still wearing his surgical gloves. They were not white anymore. He sat down on the floor of the airlock and stayed there for a long time, eyes open, looking at nothing. The black box footage arrived at the UN Emergency Coordination Center in Nairobi at 3:14 in the morning. The duty officer on shift was a career bureaucrat named Adiz Mora. She had worked in that building for 19 years. She had processed hundreds of incident reports. She watched the full 42 minutes without moving, then picked up the phone and called the Secretary General directly, something she had never done before in her career. She said only 5 words. "You need to see this." By morning, every screen on Earth was showing the footage. By noon, every screen in human-controlled space was showing it. The Conclave had assumed the recording would be lost in the drift with the ship. They were wrong by a distance that cannot be measured. The UN War Council convened 48 hours later. Director Hannah Riel of the Human Diplomatic Corps stood before the full chamber with the kind of stillness that takes years to learn. She said, "They shot our doctors." That was her entire opening statement. She sat down. The chamber voted in silence. The vote was not about war. Not yet. It was about the ultimatum. Surrender the officers who gave the order. Pay full reparations. Grant permanent humanitarian corridor rights through the drift, protected under Loran. These were the 3 conditions. They were not unreasonable. The Conclave had 72 hours to respond. Grand Executor Dron received the ultimatum in his council chamber surrounded by 7 advisors. He read it once. He set it on the table. He told his advisors to draft a counteroffer that conceded nothing, and he told them they had until the following morning. One of his advisors, a long-serving intelligence officer named Preth, said quietly that perhaps the humans should be taken seriously. Dron looked at him the way someone looks at a person who has said something faintly amusing. "They are 2 centuries into space travel," he said. "We have been out here for 4,000 years. What exactly are they going to do?" He did not ask that question again after the war. He was never really in a position to ask questions again after the war. Ambassador Rule, the Conclave's own envoy stationed inside human space, sent a private message to the council that same night. He had been watching the human news networks for 48 hours straight. He had been watching the faces of people on the streets in cities across a dozen worlds. He had been watching what happened when humans got very, very quiet. His message read, "Accept the terms, all of them, do it now. You do not understand what you are looking at." The message was filed and ignored. 72 hours passed. No response came from the Conclave. On Earth in Nairobi, Adiz Mora watched the deadline expire from the same desk where she had watched the footage 3 days before. She turned off the news feed. She picked up her bag. She went home and hugged her children for a long time without explaining why. She knew what came next. Everyone did. The first thing the Conclave got wrong was the farms. They had studied human military assets, fleet numbers, weapons yields, troop counts, industrial output as of 3 years prior. What they had not studied was what happened to a human industrial world when its population decided all at once that something needed to be built. The farming moon of Series 4 grew food for 11 billion people. Within 6 days of the Conclave's silence, its underground fabrication plants had retooled entirely to hull plating. Nobody ordered them to. The workers voted on it themselves, submitted the proposal to the regional governor at midnight, had approval by dawn, and were already moving equipment before the paperwork finished processing. That was the thing about humans that no alien government had ever properly written down. They did not wait to be told. Admiral Daria Solano received her war commission not in a ceremony, but in a brief message to her personal communicator while she was reviewing repair reports on the fleet tender Harrow. The message said, "Full command authority, immediate effect, resources unlimited." She read it twice, set the communicator down, and told her logistics officer to cancel all shore leave across the fleet. She did not make a speech. She sent one fleet-wide message: "We are going, pack like you mean it." The Conclave's intelligence service reported back to Dran that humanity appeared to be mobilizing. Dran asked how long before they would be ready to cross the drift border. His intelligence chief estimated 18 months, minimum. Human military doctrine required long preparation cycles. Their last major engagement had been internal over a century ago. They were rusty. They were slow. Solano crossed the border in 29 days. She did not cross it with everything. She crossed it with enough. 3 carrier groups, 2 logistics chains that could sustain them indefinitely, and a tactical communications network so tight that every ship in the formation could share sensor data in real time. The Conclave patrol fleet that moved to intercept them was larger. It was also slower, and it was also operating on a command structure that required every decision above squad level to pass through a regional admiral before execution. By the time the Conclave admiral approved his first engagement order, Solano had already moved. The battle at the edge of the drift lasted 4 hours. The Conclave lost 9 ships. Humanity lost 2. The Conclave fleet pulled back to regroup, which was the correct tactical choice, and sent an emergency report to Dran describing what had happened in careful, professional language that nonetheless could not hide the central fact. The humans had moved like nothing the Conclave had fought before. Dran read the report and told his fleet to hold position and await reinforcement. He was not worried. He had done the math. Humanity was 1 species. The Conclave was 7. Reinforcement would come. Numbers would tell. What Dran's math did not account for was the question of what humanity was doing while waiting for the next engagement. Sergeant Voss Harlan of the Titan 9th had never been in a real war before. Standing in a forward operating base on the edge of a Conclave-controlled moon, watching the engineers around him work through the night on something none of the soldiers had been briefed on yet, he understood that this was different from anything in the archive. The engineers were building a translation array, not a communication device. A live feed, broadcasting on all known Conclave frequencies, carrying one single piece of content on a continuous loop. The footage from Mercy's Hand's black box. Harlan asked the lead engineer why they were broadcasting it into Conclave space. She did not look up from her work. Because half those Conclave species had no idea their Grand Executor was going to do this, she said. and we want them to know exactly what their flag was used for. It was a strange kind of weapon. It did not destroy ships. It did not burn cities. It simply showed the truth to people who had been kept from it, and then let the truth do what it does. 3 weeks into the broadcast, the first cracks appeared. A minor member species called the Devari submitted a formal internal protest to Dron's council, demanding an explanation. Dron suppressed it. The Devari submitted it again. On the third attempt, they sent it directly to their own public news networks and dared him to suppress that too. He tried, he could not. Ambassador Rule, still in human space, was watching all of this from a distance. He sent another private message to Dron's council. This one was shorter than the first. It said, "They are not fighting you. They are showing the galaxy who you are. There is no defense against that." Nobody replied. On the carrier group flagship, Solano was looking at a star map with her senior staff. The map showed the Conclave's interior supply lines, their logistics nodes, the communication relays that tied their 7-species coalition together. She had a theory. The Conclave was powerful because it was old and because its member species had learned to coordinate over centuries. But coordination required communication, and communication required infrastructure. And infrastructure, unlike a fleet, could not dodge. She picked up a marker and drew a line through the map. "Here," she said, "we go here first." Her staff looked at the line. It did not point at a fleet. It did not point at a planet. It pointed at the single relay station that carried 40% of all Conclave internal military communications. One of her officers said, "That's not how you win a war." Solano said, "It is if the other side doesn't know you know that." She was already moving before anyone could argue. The Conclave had a word in their oldest language that roughly translated to the patience of deep water. It was one of their highest military virtues. The idea was simple. A slow, deep force could not be rushed, could not be panicked, and eventually wore down anything placed against it. 4,000 years of warfare had confirmed this. They had never lost a long war. The problem was that humanity did not fight long wars. When Solano's strike team hit the communications relay at Veth Station, they did it in 11 minutes. No warning, no declaration, no demand for surrender. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel, disabled the relay with a precisely targeted pulse weapon that had been designed specifically for this infrastructure type, and were gone before the nearest Conclave defense fleet could scramble a response. The pulse weapon was new. It had not existed 4 weeks earlier. A team of engineers on the carrier group had built it in transit, from components pulled from 3 different systems, because Solano had described a problem she needed solved and they had solved it. This was the pattern that began to terrify Conclave military analysts. Every engagement, every setback, every new defensive measure they deployed was answered within days by a human adaptation that had not existed before. It was not that humans were smarter. It was that they treated every failure as information, and they processed information very, very fast. Fleet Admiral Sarath, the Conclave's senior military commander, began keeping a private log of human adaptations. Within 2 months it was 40 pages long. He kept it because he needed to understand what he was facing, and what he was facing did not match any war in the Conclave's history. Other species fought until a balance of power was reached, then negotiated. Humans, Sarath wrote, do not appear to be seeking a balance. They appear to be seeking a conclusion. On the ground, Sergeant Voss Harlan was learning the same lesson from the other side. His unit had been deployed to a contested moon called Dreth 6, where a Conclave garrison held a chain of mining facilities that also happened to control a deep space sensor array. Standard doctrine said to take the facilities sector by sector. Harlan's lieutenant, a sharp young officer named Davy Alcott, looked at the map for about 10 minutes and said the doctrine was written for a different kind of enemy. She pointed at a maintenance tunnel that ran under the entire facility chain, used by repair drones. never garrisoned because it was too small for Conclave soldiers in their standard combat suits. Human soldiers in light kit could fit. They took the entire chain in 3 hours without a single exchange of fire. The garrison, cut off and outmaneuvered, surrendered. The Conclave soldiers who walked out with their hands raised were given water and medical checks and placed in a secure holding area. Harlan watched the medic go down the line checking each one. He thought about Mercy's hand. He thought about the fact that these soldiers had not fired on Mercy's hand. Drawn had. The politicians had. These were just soldiers who had been standing on a moon doing their job. He was glad the medic was there. He was glad they were doing it right. Meanwhile, the translation array that Solano's engineers had built was producing results no military planner had predicted. The Devari, one of the Conclave's smaller member species, had been growing louder in their internal descent since the broadcasts began. Now 2 other species, the Vari and the Chaleth, were sending quiet signals through back channels to Director Riel's diplomatic office. They had not sanctioned the attack on Mercy's hand. They had not been consulted. They were, in diplomatic language that translated roughly as extremely uncomfortable, increasingly unwilling to continue sharing a coalition flag with a decision they had not made. Riel's team moved carefully. They were not trying to shatter the Conclave by force. They were simply making it easy for its own members to walk toward the door. Riel called it leaving the window open. Every message to dissenting species contained the same quiet offer. A separate peace was available at any time for anyone willing to formally distance themselves from the Mercy's hand strike. Dran responded by tightening his internal controls. He required all Conclave member communications to route through a central council review before transmission. He replaced 2 dissenting council members with loyalists. He gave a public address describing the human advance as a border skirmish being exaggerated by enemy propaganda. His own military knew better. Sareth sent him a private report after the fall of Dreth 6 that was, by the standards of Conclave military writing, alarming in its honesty. It said the Conclave's standard doctrine of deep patience was failing because it assumed an enemy that would stabilize and wait. Humans did not wait. Every day the war continued, they learned more. Every day, the gap between Conclave and human tactical effectiveness narrowed. In 6 months, Sareth estimated, it would be gone entirely. Dran's response to this report was to request that Sareth reframe it in less alarming language before circulating it to the full council. Sareth did not reframe it. He sent it as written. Then he began, very quietly, doing something that would have ended his career if Dran had known. He started drafting a private opening for a direct conversation with Admiral Solano. He was not ready to send it yet, but he was thinking about it. In a forward medical tent on Dreth 6, Dr. Rael Akin finished treating a Conclave soldier's shrapnel wounds. The soldier looked at him. Akin looked back. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the situation did not already say for itself. Akin taped the bandage, moved to the next patient and kept working. He always kept working. There was a wall in the UN War Council building in Nairobi where someone had posted 89 photographs. No order, no labels, just faces, printed on plain paper and taped up in a rough grid. Nobody official had put them there. Nobody removed them. Every person who walked through that corridor had to pass those faces. Director Hannah Riel passed them every morning. She did not stop walking. She did not look away. She had made a rule for herself in the early weeks of the war. Look at them, all of them, every day. Do not let them become a number. When the Vari species sent their third back-channel signal asking about separate peace terms, Riel sat with her senior team for 6 hours and did something that surprised all of them. She said that before they finalized the offer, she wanted every negotiator in the room to know the name of at least one person from that wall. Not a statistic, a name, one person, who they were, what they did. Her deputy, Faris, looked up a nurse named Calla Drent, 26, 2 years out of medical school, who had been in the triage bay when the second shot hit. When the Vari offer was being drafted, he insisted the preamble name all 89, before anything else. The Vari agreed to this without argument. That told Riel something important. They were not coming to the table reluctantly. They were ashamed, and they needed a way to say so. This was new territory. Riel had trained for traditional diplomacy, for negotiations between parties who each believed they were right. She had not trained for this, which was something closer to a confession. She adjusted. Meanwhile, on the carrier group flagship, Solano was dealing with a different kind of problem. Her cascade doctrine was working, too well in one sense. The Conclave's communication blackouts, supply chain disruptions, and the growing fractures in their coalition had pushed their frontline forces into a kind of desperate, uncoordinated aggression. Units cut off from central command were making their own decisions. Some of those decisions were ugly. A Conclave garrison on the moon Preth-9, isolated and receiving no resupply for 3 weeks, opened fire on a civilian cargo vessel that came within range of their sensors. The cargo vessel was not human. It was Vari. 2 Vari crew members died. Solano got the report and sat with it for a long time. She called Director Riel. The Vari just got hit by the same coalition they're still technically a member of, Solano said. How do we handle this without making it look like we're using it? Riel's answer was immediate. We don't use it at all. We express condolences to the Vari directly, we offer any support they need, and we say nothing about what it means politically. We let them draw their own conclusions. Solano asked, and if they don't? Riel said, they will, they already have. She was right. Within 48 hours, the Vari had formally withdrawn from the Conclave coalition. They did not join the human side. They simply stepped back, declared their space neutral, and opened their trade corridors to humanitarian traffic. It was exactly what the Mercy Corridor terms had asked for. They were granting it on their own, before any agreement was signed. On Dreth 6, Sergeant Harlan's unit had been assigned a new kind of mission, joint patrol with a small team of Devari soldiers whose government had similarly begun distancing itself from Dran's coalition. The Devari were not officially allies. They were not enemies. They were something the military field manual had no category for. The first patrol was deeply uncomfortable. Nobody shot anybody, which Harlan counted as a success. The Devari soldiers were taller than humans, moved in a way that made them look like they had too many joints, and communicated with each other in a series of low-frequency sounds that the translation earpiece rendered with a half-second delay. On the third day of joint patrol, one of the Devari soldiers sat down next to Harlan during a rest break and through the translation earpiece said something that came through as, "We saw the ship, the white one. We saw what was done to it." Harlan said, "Yeah." The Devari soldier was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We have doctors too." Harlan looked at him. "I know." They sat without talking for the rest of the break. When the patrol resumed, the Devari soldier moved up alongside Harlan instead of keeping to the other side of the formation. Harlan did not comment on it. Back in the Conclave's capital, Dran was watching his coalition shrink in real time. 2 species gone, a third wavering. His internal security forces were now spending more effort managing dissent within the remaining member worlds than they were managing the war. He had fired 3 advisors in 2 weeks. The ones who remained told him only what he wanted to hear. Sareth still told him the truth. Sareth told him the truth in a report so plainly written that even Dran could not misread it. The war was lost. Not immediately. Not today. But the trajectory was fixed and no available option reversed it. The only remaining question was how much it would cost before the end. Dran read the report. He put it in a drawer. He told his team to draft a statement describing recent military operations as a stabilization success. In the drawer, under the report, was Rule's very first message, the one sent the day the ultimatum was issued. "Accept the terms, all of them, do it now." Dron had never replied to it. He thought about that briefly, and then he closed the drawer. The message from Fleet Admiral Sareth arrived in Solano's personal channel at 400, flagged with no official header, no Conclave military encryption, nothing that would identify it as anything other than a private communication from a private individual. Solano read it once. Then she called her intelligence officer and had it verified 6 different ways before she believed it. Sareth had sent her everything. Not a ceasefire proposal, not a demand, not a negotiating position. He had sent her the original order, signed by Dron, authorizing the Drift Patrol to use force to discourage human movement into the buffer zone. He had sent her the internal council debate that preceded the attack on Mercy's Hand, including the minutes from the session where 3 council members raised objections and were overruled. He had sent her the names of every official who had reviewed and approved the patrol's rules of engagement. At the bottom, Sareth had written, "I have served the Conclave for 31 years. What was done to that ship was contempt. I will not defend contempt. Do with this what you must. I accept the consequences." Solano sat with that paragraph for a long time. Then she forwarded everything to Director Riel. Riel's response came back in under an hour. It said, "Do not publish this yet. Let me work." Riel understood what Sareth had handed them. It was not just evidence. It was a key. The 3 remaining Conclave member species had stayed in the coalition because their governments were still uncertain whether the attack on Mercy's Hand had been a collective decision or Dron's alone. This documentation answered that question with full source material and signatures. It showed them exactly who had made the choice, exactly who had known, and exactly who had let it happen. Riel sent the documents to the 3 remaining member governments through private diplomatic channels before they were published anywhere. She included a single cover note. "These came from inside your own command structure. We are giving them to you first. What you do with them is your choice." She gave them 24 hours. The response took 16. All 3 species submitted formal notifications of coalition withdrawal before the day was out. Their statements were different in language but identical in substance. They had not known, they did not approve, they were done. Dron's government released a statement calling the withdrawals illegal under the Conclave Charter. By that point, the Conclave Charter was governing exactly 2 member species, both of which were Dron's own homeworld's direct client states. The statement was ignored by everyone, including the news services that received it. When the documents were released publicly, the reaction in Conclave space was not directed at humans. It was directed at Dron. Citizens told the war was defensive were now reading their own government's meeting minutes from the session where the decision to intimidate a hospital ship had been made. The Devari public reaction was particularly fierce. Protests outside Conclave embassies on 3 Devari worlds. One protest sign, photographed and shared across every network in the galaxy, said simply, "They were doctors." That single image traveled faster than any military bulletin. In the field, Harlan's unit received orders to hold position and await further instructions. The Conclave garrison on the adjacent sector had gone silent, not in a threatening way, in a confused way. Nobody was shooting at anything. Nobody seemed to know what they were doing. On the 3rd day of quiet, a Conclave officer walked out with both hands raised and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. Harlan walked out to meet him. The officer said the garrison had not received orders in 5 days. They had food for another 10. He wanted to know if there was a way to resolve the situation without anyone dying. Harlan called his lieutenant. His lieutenant called up the chain. The chain had not dealt with a voluntary surrender of a full garrison before, and had to figure out the protocol in real time. While they were figuring it out, Harlan stood with the Conclave officer in the space between the lines, and neither of them said much. At one point, the officer asked if it was true that humans had only been in space for 2 centuries. Harlan said yes. The officer was quiet for a while after that. "That is not very long," the officer said finally. "No," Harlan agreed, "it's not." The officer looked at him. "You fight like it has been much longer." Harlan thought about Mercy's hand. He thought about the wall of photographs in Nairobi, 89 faces taped up by somebody who just needed them to be seen. "We fight like it matters," he said. "That's different." The formal end of the conclave came not as a dramatic moment, but as a series of bureaucratic filings. Dron was placed under arrest by his own remaining council members, who had concluded that continuing to support him was a worse position than distance. The military command structure dissolved without him. Sareth submitted his own surrender through the same private channel he had used to contact Solano. Solano accepted it with 2 sentences. She wrote, "Received. The terms remain what they were on the first day." The terms were what Riel had put on the table before the first shot of the war. It had all been there from the start. Accountability for the 89, reparations, the Mercy Corridor, permanent and protected. It had cost a year and a half and a number of lives nobody ever stated out loud, because saying it aloud made it too real to sit with. Harlan watched the garrison walk out with hands raised. He counted them as they came. He thought, these are the ones who made it to the end, on both sides. That was not nothing. He held on to that. The treaty was signed in a room that no one had used in a long time. It was a conference hall in the old UN building in Geneva, the one that predated the space age by 2 centuries, with high windows and wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them. Someone on the protocol team had suggested a newer venue, something more appropriate to an interstellar agreement. Director Riel had said no. She wanted the old room. She did not explain why. Anyone who thought about it for a moment understood. The document was called the Treaty of the Mercy Corridor, not the Treaty of the Drift, not the Conclave Armistice. The Mercy Corridor. Riel had insisted on the name and had not moved on it through 5 rounds of drafting discussions. Every signatory nation and species had to say the name when they signed. That was a condition. The preamble named all 89, before the articles, before the terms, before any of the language of law and obligation. 89 names in alphabetical order, their rank or role, and the single line, killed aboard UNHS Mercy's hand while performing humanitarian service. The signing took 4 hours because there were many signatories. Riel stood through all of it. When the last signature was placed, she stood for another moment in the silence, then turned and walked back through the wooden-floored corridor without a word to anyone. Faris caught up with her outside. He said, "That's it then." Riel looked out at the Geneva street. It was raining lightly, ordinary rain, the kind that had nothing to do with any of this. "That's the legal part," she said. "The rest of it takes longer." What the treaty required, in practical terms. The officers who had given the firing order aboard the Conclave patrol were transferred to an interstellar tribunal and tried under the laws every species had signed at Loran. The process took 11 months. Dron faced a separate court on his homeworld. Sareth, whose surrender had ended the war, was granted narrow immunity and spent the rest of his career working with the joint humanitarian oversight body the treaty created. Nobody was entirely satisfied. Riel had expected that. The law was not built to produce satisfaction. It was built to produce a framework people could live inside. That was smaller and also the only thing that worked. Dr. Rael Akin was asked to give the address at the memorial built on the edge of the drift, at the coordinates where Mercy's hand had gone down. He was not a public speaker. He said this several times to the people who asked him. They kept asking. He eventually said yes because he realized saying no was a decision too, and he did not want that to be his decision. He wrote the address himself. He stood at the memorial on a day when the drift looked like nothing at all, just stars and cold and silence. He said, 89 people came out here to help strangers they had never met. They went because that is what you do when someone needs help and you can help. That is the entire reason the ship existed, and someone decided that was a good target. He paused. I have thought a lot about what to feel about that. I have tried anger. Anger is honest, but it is not a plan. I have tried forgiveness. Forgiveness is real, but it does not mean what happened was acceptable. What I have landed on is something simpler. I think those 89 people would have kept working if they had survived. I think they would have come back out here on the next ship and done it again. Because that is the kind of people they were. So I do the same. Every day. That is how I honor them. Not speeches, work. He folded his notes. He walked back from the podium. Nobody clapped. That felt right. Sergeant Harlan was not at the memorial. He had been rotated home months earlier and was doing a physical rehabilitation program in a facility in Auckland that nobody outside his family knew about. He was fine. He just had a knee that had never fully recovered from the Dreth 6 deployment and needed more time than anyone had initially thought. He watched the memorial broadcast on a screen in the rehab facility lounge and thought about the Conclave officer he had stood with between the lines. The one who had noticed humans had only been in space for 2 centuries. Harlan wondered sometimes what had happened to that officer. The garrison had surrendered and been processed and eventually repatriated. The officer had been polite. He had followed all the procedures. He had thanked Harlan, which had felt strange. Harlan had not known what to say, so he had said "You're welcome," which also felt strange but was at least honest. He hoped the officer was fine. He did not know why exactly. He just did. The Mercy Corridor opened 3 months after the treaty. It ran through the drift, permanently charted, permanently patrolled by a joint force of human and former Conclave species ships. Any humanitarian vessel allowed free passage at any time with no filing requirements and no permission needed. The first ship to use it was a new vessel, white hull, Red Cross, UNHS Mercy's Hand II. It was on a Mercy run to a disaster zone 4 systems away. Its manifest was public. Its crew of 340 included doctors, nurses, medics, and support staff. It was not shot at. An alien patrol ship fell into escort formation without being asked, and the 2 ships moved through the drift together in silence, and neither of them needed to say anything about what that meant, because it was already said.